Hello, this is California in Focus, and I'm Madeline Shannon here today with Kenneth Schrupp. So, tell us about the latest on your investigation into the CalPERS ESG fund that you wrote about last week. Your story this week that followed up on last week's story has to do with what Assemblymember Carl DeMaio, a Republican from San Diego, is asking the federal government to do. What was he asking?
That's right. Assemblyman Carl DeMaio has requested that the Federal Department of Justice look into and investigate any wrongdoing or possible fiduciary negligence at the California Public Employees Retirement System. This is regarding these clean energy fund losses that were exposed by our investigation that was published last week. Nearly $500 million was put into this clean energy and technology fund, and 71% of it was lost. So the real loss, when you look at the possible investment losses, if they just put this into the S&P 500, you know, we're looking at a loss of billions of dollars possibly in real lost value because of just misallocation of funds. So DeMaio is here asking for an investigation into whether fiduciary duty was violated. Potentially, maybe there was some fraud happening, because there are some interesting statutes here where CalPERS and the other main state retirement fund, CalSTRS, there are exemptions in Public Records Act transparency requirements for documents regarding so-called alternative investment classes. Alternative investment classes do include private equity funds. So when I requested the contract, for example, the management contract for this fund, they couldn't provide it to me because it is exempted in the text of the law. And so Carl not only said that he's starting to look for a federal investigation here, but that he is looking into legislation or other changes that can be made that could require more transparency in these investments.
And how did CalPERS officials respond to your investigation last week and any subsequent questions that you've sent them since?
Number one is they said that was other people a long time ago who made this mistake. And in a certain sense, that is true, because this fund was created in 2007. It's now 2025. It's been a while. There's been a lot of personnel turnover. It is true that CalPERS also made a major reorganization of its private equity investment strategy in, I believe it was 2022. But what's also true is that they're significantly increasing their private equity target for their portfolio. But in 2021, they increased their private equity target from 7% to 13%. That is how much of their portfolio is in private equity. And in 2024, they increased that target even higher to 17%. As we noted in our last story, I did talk to financial experts who really think that private equity can be a great investment for private investors dealing with their own money. There's no principal agent problem there. But when you have a public pension fund that's putting its money into these investments, it's really hard to know how much those investments are valued, because with private equity, these assets aren't traded on the public market, right? You don't really know how much the company is worth until it's been sold. Price discovery takes place truly once you've actually sold the asset, which can take years and years and years. So the actual gains of these portfolios hard to measure until you have it actually sold. There's also this aspect of you can't really sell it quickly, right? If you own stocks or bonds that are traded on the public market, your pension system needs some money to pay retirees what they're owed. You can sell those pretty quickly. Um, Private equity, you need to go find a buyer. You need to conduct a private transaction. It could take some time, and that's this combination of opacity, that is, like, you don't know how much the assets are worth, and illiquidity, you can't really move them quickly, or why a lot of financial experts are worried about private equity becoming such a large portion of state pensions retirement portfolios. This other issue of transparency, though, is we don't really know where the money is going. These CalPERS employees, um, they're well paid for government employees, but would they be considered well paid for the private sector equivalent of how much money they manage? Not really. So when we look at this growing reliance on private equity, which is where maybe a lot of people want to end up. Um, there are some natural questions of, well, what is happening here with these investments? Do we know if people who are in the public sector are maybe one day going to be profiting from how they've helped out the private sector with these opaque investments, maybe at a portfolio company, maybe at one of these private equity companies? But we have more stories coming on this, so I promise you can keep up with this whole thread with a new series that we're doing on private equity and public pensions.
Well, that'll be fascinating to follow. But one last question for you, Kenneth. Do you think that the U.S. Department of Justice will actually investigate this?
There's a chance. There was one story where I uncovered this growing reliance of homeless housing funding on federal vouchers. That is, we have these mega towers being built by just, pretty much by one major homelessness nonprofit in LA, and they're relying on federal HUD vouchers to accomplish this. You have the city and state shoveling up some money up front into producing these buildings, and then they're relying on the federal government to more than pay them back with these HUD Section 8 vouchers. And very soon after that story, we did see the Department of Justice start to look into this nonprofit Weingart for possible issues with its transactions. It's possible we might see something like this happen uh, for the CalPERS Clean Energy and Technology Fund. But again, this investment was sometime in the past, and a lot of people probably may have moved on already. I'm not sure what's going to happen here, but we can definitely learn more about whether there have been real investments that were made because of political reasons, or whether this was done in the fiduciary duty for California retirees.
Well, thank you so much for answering all my questions, Kenneth. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
This is California in Focus, and joining me is Kenneth Schrupp. This is Madeline Shannon. Join us next time.